and sunny, and of course it was cheerful, but reminded me that the old expression, das ist immer klar, wenn Engel reisen, which is, it's always clear when angels travel, so thank you, our German friends. And now we're going off up to the next port called Puerto Madryn, and then the great city of Buenos Aires. And so now we are truly entering Argentine territory. If you look at the map carefully, we're not far off the coast, and we've left the Falklands, and now are going to what's central Patagonia, and this great bay of the Valdez Peninsula, and this great wildlife center of around the coast of Patagonia. And then the great contrast to that is the great capital of Argentina, the northern city, though most of us think it's south, and then this part of Argentina and South America is south to much of the rest of South America. So this, one of the writers was saying that the sense of south also gives people a sense of freedom, because the further you go south in this continent, at least it gets wilder and, let's say, freer than the more crowded north and the very different parts of other parts of South America. But today I'm going to just contrast these two, because we have a difference of a great city, and then we're going, especially tomorrow, this wilderness area. Now, of course, Argentina is very long. It's almost as long as Chile, almost 4,000 miles from tip to toe. And then it is, of course, the great River Plate, Rio Plata, that is the center of it. Now, this is the Valdez Peninsula. There are all these other great bays, and this whole coast is very wild and mostly uninhabited, actually. This is Patagonia on this side, just like on the fjordlands of Chile, is relatively sparsely populated, only a few centers. So you have these great sweeps of inland. Now, I had said that both Chile and Argentina call this area Patagonia, but they are diametrically different once you cross either side of the Andes. Here on the Argentine side, you have these pampas and this deserts down as far as down where we're going, and this place which is about as barren and not really empty of life, as much as that it does not have a great deal of either humans nor even a lot of wildlife. We've already seen the guanaco and the rhea and other Patagonian animals on our trip already, but as we're coming up this coast, it actually gets drier and less full of life, and every piece of scrub hangs on to the arid desert and up into the Andes. This side of the Andes is also very dry. All that rain falls in Chile, up to 5 meters a year in some of those places where we just were. But over this side in what's called the wind shadow, this is a desert, mountain, and plain area, then going down to a desert in the sea. There are rivers that flow down, and they became the course of settlement and transportation through here. Now it is mostly a recreational area. There is also mining and also sheep and ranch activity. But the more you go north in Argentina, actually northwest of Buenos Aires, that's where the rich agricultural land. Further down here, it's often empty, to the point where now they've made a lot of national parks. Here's one that is the Monte Leon, which is it's a kind of a limestone configuration that's very interesting near the shore, just south of Puerto Madryn. And this was bought by that American entrepreneur, Donald Tompkins, who then gathered 500,000 acres between different pieces of land down there and have given it to the government of Argentina as a national park, just like he's done the same thing over on the Chilean side. This has stirred up some of the nationalists in both countries of why is a foreigner buying land and giving it to us? But that's part of the preservation effort that is going on in different parts of this area before there's any other development in it. And then Monte Leon, there's this great arch that is over a river going out to sea that's one of the dramatic sights. Some of the wildlife is very adapted to the desert land. This is called the mata, that's actually a native name. It's called a Dolcitis patagonius in its Latin name, but it's like a giant, sort of looks like a cross between a dog and a rabbit, but it's actually a rodent. And so this was hunted for food. Now they're still out there a while in the pampas. They're sort of like a prairie dog almost in the North American plains. An even more cuddly creature is the large Patagonian armadillo, which when I was a kid living in Texas, we used to grab these things and use them as footballs. But you're not allowed to do that anymore. These get pretty big down here, though. They're much bigger than the North American variety, but equally charming looking. They burrow and they come out. They're mostly nocturnal and feeding on insects and plants. And then there used to be this area, a lot of dinosaurs back before our time, and so they keep finding more bones down here. It's sort of like the Mongolia of the Americas, in that there's a lot of, because of the sedimentary rocks, erosion, they keep finding skeletons. There was one in the paper the other day. They found a very large sort of T-Rex, new species of dinosaur down here. So near south of Puerto Madryn, there is a dinosaur museum like this. And there were also, as I said earlier, prehistoric caves of early hominids, and they keep backdating the time of human settlement here, going back over 10,000 years now. This is again that cave of Los Manos Pintados, the painted hands of the mountains up above in the Andes in this cave. But where we are, it's on the flatlands, and there are rivers that come out, and this one just north of where we're landing is called the Rio Negro, which has a large flow into the sea that gathers this vast land, what water there is coming out of the mountains. And here we are in the next province called Chubut, and Puerto Madrid is in this great Golfo Nuevo, this is called, and this is the Valdez Peninsula. It has all these different points and other bays with all of the wildlife. And this whole area has been called the Serengeti of the sea because it has so much marine life in it. And then there's some towns and settlements. So this is the Rio Chubut down here. This is the Welsh settlement area just south of Puerto Madryn. Now, Puerto Madryn itself is not a very handsome city. It's fairly good sized. It's a major commercial port for this area, gathers agricultural goods, and but it's mainly a tourist area now because this has become such a draw for environmentalists, marine biologists, and visitors for all over the world. And so we will dock there and have some time in the town if you're taking a city tour, but most of us are going to go off to the great peninsula and see the wildlife. Here's a view of the beach. This town has no mountains near it. It's sort of just it's on this great bay that we'll sail into first thing in the morning tomorrow. Here's a look at from above, though. This is the city right there. There are all these also salt lakes in the middle of it, and the other points where all the animals are. It's also, of course, famous for its whale watching. So this is the look of this area. It's very rugged. There are a lot of cliffs that come right down to the sea. So this was sort of one of those lonely shores for the original sailors exploring down here. They had a very hard time even landing anywhere. And again, there's shipwrecks on the points because back in the days of old sailing vessels, they often would not know what was right ahead until it was too late. But there are a lot of our good little friends, the penguins, all over the place. This is major spawning ground for especially the Magellanic penguins that migrate up from the south during the austral winter. Now, of course, they have gone south to feed and to raise their chicks and things like we saw the other day. But if you haven't seen enough penguins by now, there's a few more waiting for you. And so they usually in this area, though, because it's so dry, they actually sort of look like, again, groundhogs. They dig their burrows in the soft ground. Some of us saw the nesting on rocks and with twigs in the Falklands, but this is almost like a desert penguin, which is most curious. But there are millions of them along in here. And then there are the sea lions, which are the lobos del mar, that are, again, coming on these great sweeps of beaches to breed and calve, and then they go out into the currents here. Now there's a confluence of currents coming down the coast from Brazil, and then there's cold water coming up from the Southern Ocean, kind of curling around by the Falklands. You felt that wind there, and that's the sort of thing that drives the waters together. The nutrients are up well, the krill and the squid and all the various fish are in these waters, and that's why a point of land like the Valdez Peninsula has a great deal of support for all of these animals who go out there and feed and then come and take it easy. Now, you will see a lot of seals also, and if you had the time and the certification, you could go swimming with the seals like this, and they're very, very friendly. There has been no hunting in this area for so long now that they are fairly inured to the sight of us curious creatures, and so you can actually go and enjoy them for who they are underwater. They're often a bit of a blob on the beach, but they're very agile in the water, of course. The other great thing to do here is, of course, to go whale watching. So they have a fleet of boats right out of Puerto Madrid that goes out into the bays. Now, these are mostly the right whales, the southern right whale, which is a Southern Ocean species that comes up the coast of South America, Africa, and around southern parts of Australia, New Zealand. It does not actually go to the northern hemisphere where the northern right whales are, but they're very similar. They're a baleen-feeding whale, meaning they're not carnivorous. They're straining small plankton and small krill and things in their teeth. They're not toothed, in other words. They have that sheet of cartilage, which is their sort of strainer in their big mouth. And then they have barnacles that grow, crustaceans on their head. So you see this is the growth there. He has an eye right there. That's the big mouth. They were called the right whale because they have a tendency, if they are killed, to float, and that they don't exhale, and they were called right because they were so easy to catch. You could harpoon them and just tie it and tow it back to the ship. They were hunted almost to extinction down in further south, the Falklands, and then down South Georgia Island was the main hunting grounds. And they used to hunt them off of here, but again, they're protected in Argentina, and they are a great sight to be seen. Their markings, though, mean that each one can be individually tracked by photography, so they know them by name and number, and they can follow the season and their life cycle very accurately now. So there's a Museum of Oceanography, a number of marine biological stations here, and so this is a major attraction for scientists and visitors. Now there's other people that were here though originally. Here's some of the Tehuelche native Patagonians who are now either assimilated or gone. There's no more spoken language or pure blood of them left at all. And they were encountered down here first by the Welsh settlers. So this is Lewis Jones, who 1865 brought 153 Welsh from Wales, and they sent out a ship from Liverpool, the Mimosa, that came down and landed north of Puerto Madrid, and they settled into the valley of the Chubut River Valley, just south of here. So this is an area they call Welsh Patagonia. I don't know, do we have any Welsh in the audience? All right, well, good to meet you. That's one of my stripes of Adams, of my mother's side. But we got exiled into that North American confusion. We didn't make it to Patagonia, which of course was quite a shock because you come from the green and let's say well-watered hills of Wales, and you come down to Patagonia, you say, boy, I should have checked my ticket, because they came down here and they were going to set up sheeping and dairy and farming and things, and they were faced with desert conditions, unfriendly natives, the Tehuelches, who they actually made better relations with finally than the Spanish, who enslaved them. But nonetheless, they set up these towns, and here's the view of Puerto Madryn back when it was had its first dock and first town settlements. The first settlers, though, lived in cave dwellings on the cliffs. There were natural caves, so they wintered over their first years and in these caves, which are still there in sort of historical monument to this few that came down this far. And then they moved upland and they found water supplies. The river valleys are fairly lush further up from the rugged coast, and so they made what they call camps in the campo, and then had let's say, a very isolated life, and but fairly prosperous. And so the Welsh Patagonian neighborhood still speaks Welsh, though all of them all speak Spanish also now. And now many more people have moved in, so there's not a majority of Welsh people in the area. But back in 1932, there was a terrible flood in this whole valley. It's sort of like we're seeing floods all over the world now. Well, we're not having one in Patagonia now, but they did have a flooding that washed out the entire Chubut River Valley and all of the Welsh settlements. And that created a great deal of hardship, of course, for the towns that were all flooded out. It also meant that many of them chose to be evacuated. Canada sent down a ship to take those who wanted to move to the more comfortable plains of Manitoba or something, where they finally settled in Canada. Anyway, this is the heritage of this neighborhood just south of Puerto Madryn. So here's the Welsh Argentine flag. And there's some little small hamlets that still have some of the original chapels and also homes. And some of them are museums now to the original pioneers. And they have a Welsh festival every year, which you can see the original flag in of Wales and the Patagonian one. So this tradition goes on as an example of how many people have come to South America and Argentina. There are also tea houses, and this particular one, my Welsh stumbles along, but that's where Princess Diana came and visited, and they have a shrine to her there in the tea house. The other thing you can do up here, I'll show you things we're not going to get to do, of course, is take the Patagonia Express called La Tronchita, which is a train that comes from up the Rio Negros and goes up into the Andes to the Lake District. And this is one of the old steam huffers that they've kept going, and it's now an excursion train made famous by Paul Thoreau, wrote the book The Patagonian Express, and he was a train buff, so he took this up into the mountains, and it goes quite a ways up to the town of Nahuel, where you can go off into the hiking in the Great Mountains and over to Chile if you want. So this is something quite something to be seen and heard if you like trains, because it still is a good old steam engine, so it makes a lot of noise and it sounds just right. And the cars are still over 100 years old, made of wood, and so they rattle properly. It's sort of like being on a ship. You either like it or you don't. But I always found train travel to be somewhat restricting, because they don't let you walk out on deck and get fresh air in the same way. But here it is going up into the foothills of the Andes. Now I'm going to move up into the far north of Argentina, and this is the valley of the Rio Plata, or the Rio Plate, River Plate. Of course, Plata means silver in Spanish, so it never got the name Silver River in English. I don't know why. But this drains a tremendous area all the way up through Paraguay into Brazil, and so it's, let's say, just the other side of the Amazon basin in its upper regions, and it has a great area called the Pantanal. This is a great wetlands and grasslands and wilderness area that, again, is under some impact from climate change, because it's drying out now, just like the Amazon is because of the deforestation. And so, but it draws a tremendous amount of water from southern Brazil all the way down to the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, where we are going to be sailing into Montevideo and then to Buenos Aires. Now this river is tremendous. It's just its delta and its mouth are bigger than the Netherlands, so it's one of the major rivers of the world. Not nearly as big as the Amazon, but it's bigger than the Mississippi, for instance, or most other rivers. And so then the great city of Buenos Aires is on the south bank, and Montevideo, so you see, is over on this point. And then Punta del Este is actually off the map, out on a peninsula in the Atlantic. But we will be seeing plenty of it as we come in. And but you can see that it's a delta that has this is the sort of the delta jungle that's in that area, and then a flow out to sea. Punta del Este is right there, by the way, and that's Montevideo, and Buenos Aires is that big conglomeration there. But you can see the river is sort of muddy and doesn't run very clear, just because it's draining a lot of flat lands and agricultural lands. The rich agricultural lands of the Pampas are up further into the Argentine north. But here's another view of it. That is Buenos Aires right there, which is spreading itself ever wider in this great plain. So Buenos Aires as a city doesn't actually have any great constriction in its suburbs. So if you've been there before, you know that it's actually a city of many neighborhoods, colonias, that are out far into the countryside. And so it is one of the gigantic cities of South America. It's second to Sao Paulo in population, so it's about 12 million in the whole metropolitan area. And this river, though, has, like the Amazon and the Yangtze and a few other tropical rivers, its own an endemic species, most notably the La Plata dolphin, which is a river dolphin with the shark beak snout. It's like there's one in the Ganges, there's one in the Irrawaddy. The one in the Yangtze is now extinct for reasons that are tragic, but Rio de la Plata has the same problems. A lot of industrial pollution, agricultural runoff, fishing, and just too many humans around, so that they are also endangered. Here's a juvenile that was rescued near Buenos Aires, and so you can see it has this long snout on it. But they're very hard to see. They're in the water's too murky to see them usually. You may have been to the Amazon. They have the Amazon dolphin, though that actually is more easily seen because it's in an area of the Amazon that's clear water. But here we are in the state of Buenos Aires. The city has its own district, but it has also the whole region, and this is the flag, which has the industrial and the agricultural symbols with the sun of Argentina there. And if you just have time to be in Buenos Aires, there's a number of places to go. Someone was asking me about going over to La Colonia, which is a colonial town on the other side of the river. It's actually part of Uruguay. That's about a 2-hour boat ride across from the downtown docks of Buenos Aires. Or you can take an easier trip to a place called Tigre, which is up into the delta, and there's a urban light rail line that goes up on the coast up into the delta of the Paraná and the Rio de la Plata area, which is a traditional holiday place. So I'll just show you a little of this just because it's one of those excursions. If you have a few extra days, you can go up and see. This was a vacation spot where the elite of Buenos Aires would go up, and this is the Italian canottieri paddle club for canoe and shell racing on the river. And here's one of the other yacht clubs, La Marina. And so this was where the elegant and those who could afford it would go to have a vacation for a few days. And there are a lot of homes along the river up there. Here's the Museum of Art in Tigre. And they still have excursion boats that go up into this area and up into the delta and see some of what's left of, let's say, this low jungle that is in this area. And there are a lot of old houses up in the area. But I'm going to show you now just more about Buenos Aires. I know many of you have already been there many times, but this is, of course, a remarkable city in many ways, just because it's probably the most European of all the cities of South America, and famous for its architecture and its pride and its style, which has always been one of its problems. And though Dr. Daci talked a lot about the political problems of Argentina, I'm going to show you more of how the city developed and how it ended up the way it is now. It is a very old city for the Americas, 1536, which predates North American settlement. And as an example how the Spanish came right around and started to get into this area, realizing that it was such good land for agriculture. So it was set up that early, and the first settlers had to have fortified town versus the Tehuelche Indians, who were not friendly, particularly the way the Spanish tended to either enslave them or put them to work. And so you had this elite that came as encomiendos. They get land grants that implied complete control of the land and anybody that was on it, and they spread out from Buenos Aires around. So there was always a very elitist sense of the landowners in Argentina, particularly because the land was so valuable, so productive. But they never brought in African slaves. The Tehuelche people were enslaved. In fact, so they were rounded up and put to slave labor, but then they mixed in and became Argentine. So there's a trace of Tehuelche in some modern Argentines, but the majority have certainly been the European blood from all the different countries, especially from Italy and Spain. But here's a few pictures of the early days around Buenos Aires and the Tehuelche, who were still around in the greater broadlands. They became the great horsemen that then became the tradition of the gaucho. So here we have a Tehuelche with his bolo, the balls they would swing on a string to snare a running bird or another animal. And so this is still a tradition. If you're going to go out to the countryside, particularly I think Montevideo, to Estancia, you'll see this kind of horsemanship. And it was really a fusion of the native with the Spanish riding capabilities and the horses that came to the New World. And so the gaucho tradition was begun right as the settlements spread out from Buenos Aires, and then they became the famous cattlemen of Argentina. We went and saw that estancia near Punta Arenas, where I made the mistake saying, "Oh, your sons are such good caballeros." He said, "No, they're huascos." The Chileans have a different name, and they said, "Don't call us gauchos. Those are those crazy Argentine," as if they're all that different. But the gauchos are a very strong culture. But of course now you heard that a lot of the free-range cattle are now being put into feedlots, and it's getting agribusiness instead of that cattle herding as was the tradition. But anyway, in Buenos Aires, this was a rapidly developing city from its founding. Though Argentina's history has had a lot of ups and downs between revolutions, civil wars, juntas, civil strife, but a lot of it is the dynamic between the immigrant urban population, many who have come as refugees, and then all of the wealthy landowners who then have, let's say, their servant class in the countryside. But you always had a very sharp class distinction between those who had and those who had not. And as Buenos Aires developed, the elite did better and better, and more people came in. This is the story of the Americas in most places, many places. But the people of Buenos Aires were always considered very cosmopolitan because they had the shipping links back to Europe and the commercial relations. So you could say Buenos Aires had both the port culture, but it also was very broad and had a lot of space to grow, and a lot of labor was coming in. So it's become a very successful city because it's a port. And the locals always will call themselves porteños or porteñas, which means we are the people of the port and capable. So you could say it has the elegance of Paris, but it's also the commercial vitality of New York by a rough analogy. Here is a symbol of the city that you can actually see on park benches, the ships coming in the nice warm southern sunshine to do business and to settle. And so from the waterfront up into the vast lands of the country, the city grew when the Napoleonic era caused confusion in Europe and Spain. The local nations of South America declared their independence. San Martin led the army, battled the loyalist forces. There was a battle on the River Plate at Riachuelo, which then decisively defeated the Spanish loyalist fleet that had come down to assert their control. And so then Argentina, founded in Buenos Aires, became what they call the United Provinces of the Rio Plata, and that became Argentina then. And so the city continued to grow, though, and of course the Industrial Revolution came and brought all kinds of industries here. The country's economy was still essentially agricultural, and at about 1900 it was the world's largest exporter of beef and also grains, and made Buenos Aires a very wealthy city based on its very busy port trade. So this is Puerto Madera, which is the heart of the center of the port of Buenos Aires. We will be at a larger commercial facility not far away, but this area right downtown used to have the docks, and the trains would come right out and load on to the ships right there on the wharf, and then go off to Europe and other parts of the world, or bring a lot of people in this way. And so this had, like the other parts of the Americas, was a very busy immigrant center. It's now cleaned up as a sort of waterfront park and commercial district with hotels, nightclubs, and a museum, and that's an old Argentine Navy warship that is preserved there. But as we sail in, we'll see it like this, a great skyline of the central business district. So for better or for worse, like most cities, it's become a bunch of glass boxes. And you know, Buenos Aires has a tremendous classical look to it, except now it's getting, I would say, pot-marked with giant glass office buildings, especially down toward the waterfront. But we will be landing right about here. And then that's Puerto Madera, which is the old port. And La Boca is another old port on this side. That's the old immigrant neighborhood, mostly Italian in the old days. And then you have a variety of other neighborhoods that spread out very far. This is the central business district. This is an industrial port area right here. Recoleta is the very fancy apartment and elegant part of town with the famous cemetery. And then Once was the Jewish quarter. And then it spreads out into the far reaches of a vast city. And of course, as you go out farther, it becomes generally poor. And there were a lot of poor refugees from Europe after World War I, World War II, and still some immigration coming in that makes Buenos Aires still a growing city in spite of its economic problems. But here's the center of the city again. Here's Recoleta. Just show you this if you have the time, if you haven't already been up here. This is a beautiful area. The cemetery and the museums and the parks in that area are quite handsome. And then you also have the great boulevards. Here's the Avenida of the 9th of July, the Independence Day, which is the world's broadest boulevard. And the city back at the turn of the last century was built, let's say, these great elegant office buildings like much of the world, especially a place like New York, which built them very, very high because of the constricted land. But in Buenos Aires, there was plenty of room, so these tremendous big buildings were put up with fine European craftsmanship. Many of them still remain, but in the rollover of all the business into Buenos Aires, there's a sort of a hodgepodge. It's not like, let's say, like Paris with a uniform sense to it. It has many different kinds of architecture in many neighborhoods, and then a lot of new architecture in the various boom cycles of Buenos Aires. Well, here's the Avenida 9 de Julio with the great obelisk to the independence of the country, and you can see that there's sort of a mixed commercial district. This is looking right down to the port. And here's that great obelisk, which in the literature of Argentina, they have an expression called obeliscocentrismo, which is the Buenos Aires, the porteños feel they're so important that they always think around this obelisk. And it was considered an expression of the pride of the natives of Buenos Aires, but also their arrogance toward the country people and eventually amongst themselves and to the world. So the obelisk is really quite at the center of town, and as you go out into the streets, you can sort of see where you are. Over, not far away to the south, is the government center with this another monument to San Martin, and then the Casa Rosada, which is the pink house or the presidential quarters, which is now still use part of it, but it's also a museum. You can go in and see its elegance. And then, but I was reading an Argentine story about a former president who lived there, and just for fun, every evening he'd go up and shoot his gun up in the air toward the neighborhoods, just to practice, because he didn't want to go out of town. But he liked to just sort of shoot at birds and shoot at the moon, and the bullets would fall in neighborhoods, and occasionally people would be hit. And believe it or not, this story from an Argentine writer, people would put their children outside in the yard when they knew the president was going to shoot his gun, hoping that they'd hit the kid, because if they hit the kid, they hit the jackpot. They'd go complain, and they would be rewarded. Oh, sorry, the president is just practicing. So they call it the blessing of the president if your kid would be injured by his random shooting. But this is a sort of story thing that only happens in Argentina. Well, it happens other places too. But on that square, there's also the cathedral, which is curiously Greek, and then there's a basilica behind it. But there is the remains of the great liberator San Martin that is there as the leader of the country and its independence. It's also the site of all the demonstrations. Dr. Daci mentioned how there were the desaparecidos, the families of the missing during the dirty war of the junta. Nowadays, when I was last there, just a year or so ago, they were still protesting. The veterans of the war for the Falklands were there protesting. You see the Argentine flag and the shape of the Falkland Islands. Well, you'd think they'd have something else to worry about. But, for instance, you'd think that naturally all of Tierra del Fuego and Cape Horn would be a more likely choice of their patriotism, but they already got beat by the Chileans over that before. Anyway, there's still always some demonstration in Buenos Aires because it's sort of a turbulent society. There's always some protest going on. Also in the square is Cabildo Plaza, where the independence was declared. The Congress building is nearby, so this has a sort of let's say iconic architecture sort of everywhere you look, and the town is full of towers and monuments for the various heroes of the nation. And so it's a great place just to walk around, and it's quite stunning in much of its elegance. A lot of it's in decay, though, and bad repair, just because the country's gotten poorer in the last few decades especially. So here's the Torre Inglés, the English tower built to commemorate the cooperation with the English to build the railroads, and that, as Dr. Daci said, was vandalized after the Falklands War, but it's standing in a park not far from the train station. Here's the great Teatro Colón, the Columbus Opera House, which is one of the largest in the world, certainly the biggest in South America. And the city has a great cultural life of European style. But it's full of these kind of tremendous luxury residences and offices and banks. And so this is where Argentina, especially in Buenos Aires, tried to make itself the most elegant city in the world back over 100 years ago because it thought it would be the wealthiest country in the world. And of course, World War I and then the Great Depression and other troubles followed and made it not so. But they were left with this great architecture. This is a water pumping facility, believe it or not. That is they have gigantic machinery in that wedding cake French style of itself just to provide water for the central city. But much of it is like this, a great forest of blocks and neighborhoods, and you can go out and wander in. Much of it is like Sao Paulo. You don't really even know where you are on this flat plain. It's just a urban conglomeration that spreads out quite far. But it is connected by metro, subways, and good transportation, so you can get around town. You can get a map and go. But the central business district is where the activities are. So here's Calle Florida, which is a very long walking street with a lot of shops and a lot of peddlers right on the street. So it has especially in the evening, it's very lively with a lot of people there. And but as you were warned this morning, keep your wallets inside and don't have loose bags because they're quite adept at picking your pocket. And downtown there are a lot of restaurants, again, mostly that the great beef-eating nation. Here's a paradiada for 3 people, and it's actually the prices are very reasonable all through Argentina because of the devaluation of the currency. For those of you who are interested, there's the world's greatest bookstore also in Buenos Aires. It's called El Ateneo, which is made in a great theater that then was converted into a theater for literature. So famous writers come and speak on that stage amidst all of the extensive books. And literature has always been a very important thing in Argentina for, well, reasons perhaps because it's a nation and a city that often had refugees in it, and then they were also a lot of internal refugees caused by the political troubles. So the list of the famous writers of Argentina, Borges or Cortázar, and many others, they all either spent time in jail or in exile from the country, and then they came back. And so that created a kind of a turbulent sense of importance for the writers, who were often the conscience of the country and would be the chief critics of the government. So writing was considered a very dangerous profession. But at Ateneo, it's still vaunted as one of the great activities of the populace. There's a lot of urban population, though, that live in this kind of blocks, and it's some of them are more modern than the next, but it's a very urban feeling place. And then you've also heard, or you've been to the great cemetery of Recoleta, and that is in the neighborhood near a Catholic church. And this is one of the great things to come see because it has to be one of the most elaborate cemeteries in the world. And this was, of course, the resting place of the elite of Buenos Aires and Argentina. Most of the country's leaders, their business community, and the landowners would vie for a tomb in here, and so the families would build these very elaborate tombs. And as Dr. Daci described this morning, they would refuse to face each other, or they turned the statues the other way because they didn't like the other family that was coming there. And it's full of intrigue and all kinds of stories in this very elaborate place. It was founded in 1833 by the local community, but with a French architect. So it may have been modeled after one of the Parisian cemeteries, but it has now apartment houses picking up so everybody gets a view of the cemetery. I guess can't be a great view if you're you'd rather look at the sea, but nonetheless it's a beautiful place to go visit. And there in the center of it is Eva Perron's tomb as part of the Duarte family. And as Dr. Daci described this morning, she had to have her papers rewritten, so she was no longer illegitimate and the parents weren't divorced, so she would be allowed by the church to be buried here. So that is a point of still veneration by the local Peronistas. And Dr. Dacci also showed the tomb of this young girl who was murdered by her mother for sleeping with her father. So again, a truth stranger than fiction in the Argentine literature. But a lot of Recoleta, the families have either moved away or they've been bankrupted over generations, as they tend to do. And a lot of the tombs have been falling apart, or they've been broken into by vandals to take any valuables or even the metal of this, that, or the other in the tomb. So now they have it closely guarded, but they have also a government funding to try to stabilize and protect this as a historic monument. But here's one of the family tombs that has been abandoned and falling apart. Now, another part of the city of Buenos Aires is the La Boca, which means the mouth of a smaller river. But this was the Genovese Italian neighborhood in the original waves of immigration in the late 1800s. And so this became, it was part of the port, and a lot of little houses built in this area. It has these big gates for the railroad bridge going to the main port of Puerto Madryn. But this is the site of some of the old factories. This is an old biscuit factory, which is now an art gallery. And then there's a lot of small buildings, a lot of tango clubs, and let's say the bohemian side of Buenos Aires is in this neighborhood, which is only a short walk from downtown. So it's not far, but you can go in there to the cafes and have your vino and your tango. And so this is the center of the cultural life, which is very steamy in the evening and full of street art. Here's the great tango singer Carlos Gardel, who you'll note out here. I'll spare you singing any of his songs. I'll leave that to the professionals. But you know all about tango, and I imagine some of you have tangled yourself. And this is a curious height of popular dancing when, from especially La Boca and Buenos Aires, this dance form spread around the world and became an international sensation on and off to this day. But it is, of course, characterized by these quick steps and then crossed legs and kicks and sort of almost a battle. And it was, sometimes described the ultimate dance where men and women fight until they make up. And then, but the origin of this is said to be because when the immigrants came to Buenos Aires and to start a life in Argentina, they were mostly young men, and there were not enough women around. And so they were often sultry, sitting around the ports waiting for jobs or working some terrible work, and their only relaxation was to go out at night and drink. But there were not enough women to dance with, so there were a few women that, well, let's say, were the ladies of the night, but they could have their pick of any of the men, but they would want to dance, and they would only dance with a man who knew how to dance. And so the men practiced the dance together so they could then be able and worthy to dance with a woman. And so the tango is said to have started with angry young men who were drunk, and they said, you're going to, and so they were sort of tussling, and that's how then it developed into what it is today. Now, you can ask our professional dancers on board whether that story is true, but that's what I heard in Buenos Aires years ago. And of course, it became a fantastic performance form, especially show tango is very colorful and dramatic, and here she is looking for her next date, and but it's a popular form. It was sort of let's say dismissed by another generation in the 1950s and 60s when this thing called rock and roll rolled into town, and as is much true in a lot of South America, that let's say northern music, popular music, sort of became the fashion, and so it was just the old folks who did tango anymore. Now it's come back so that in the parks in Buenos Aires, you'll see people out in the evening again, and young people doing tango, and so it's again a popular form. Nuevo tango. There's a whole new generation of musicians and writers who do commentary and descriptions in a new form. Astor Piazzolla is most famous of the new tango composers. And so there's a whole new generation of Argentines who have had a hard time in the past generations, but now Argentina is doing better. Of course, you heard from Dr. Dacci how they reneged on their $100 billion of national debt, and the peso's been devalued, and that makes it a good place to invest again if you have some security, because the costs are low, labor is not expensive. And so maybe, though, as these kids grow up, they'll do better as the country's stabilized. It no longer has a military junta that was such a tragedy for the country. But I'll tell you a very incorrect joke about a story about Argentina, which I apologize if there are any Argentines in the audience. Is the old story is, how do you get rich in Argentina? And it was where you buy the Argentines for what they think what they are worth, and then you sell them back to themselves for what they think they're worth. If I got that right. You got? Oh, laughed. Yes. Okay. On cue. Anyway, I apologize. That's a sad state of the economy, though, and maybe as it gets better organized, it'll be in better shape. But I'm going to leave you with a couple of last images from the south, because the contrast of where we've been, and we're going all the way to Montevideo, then to Buenos Aires, is truly continental. But the south is, as Paul Thoreau once said, is nowhere, but nowhere is a place. And there in Patagonia, there are no voices here. And there in Patagonia was this what I saw. And though beyond it there were mountains and glaciers and albatrosses and Indians, there was nothing to speak of, nothing to delay me further. Only the Patagonian paradox of tiny blossoms in vast spaces and nothing intermediate. Now that's truly not the way it is in Buenos Aires, but one of the tango singers and writers for Astor Piazzolla, his name is Pino Solenas. I'll read this in Spanish for you. Vuelvo al sur como se vuelvo siempre al amor. Llevo al sur como un destino del corazón. Soy del sur como los aires del bandoneón. Sueño el sur, inmensa luna, su cielo al revés. Quiero al sur, su buena gente, su dignidad. Te quiero sur, hasta pronto. So I return to the south as I return to love. I carry the south as the fate of my heart. I am the south, as are the tunes of the bandoneon accordion of the tango. I dream of the south, the immense moon and sky upside down. I love the South, your good people and your dignity, and I love to come back to the South, and I will see you again soon. Hasta pronto. And with that, I hope you will enjoy our brief time in Argentina.